Welcome to Let's Talk Death, conversations to inform and inspire. Let's Talk Death is a series of conversations with some amazing people from various fields. Our goal through these conversations is to normalize, educate, and demystify the taboo around death, dying, and the journey of grief. Hello, welcome to this episode of Let's Talk Death. I'm Fran Solomon.
And I'm Andy McNeil.
And we are thrilled to be your hosts for these conversations. Let's Talk Death is brought to you by Heal Grief, a social support network creating community after someone has died. Everything we do is inspired by our core belief that no one should ever grieve alone.
Our goal with this program is to have a friendly chat with some amazing people so we can help normalize and educate our Heal Grief community. Our guest today is Barbara Becker. Barbara is the founder of EqualShot, a strategic communications consulting firm specializing in strengthening the voice of the nonprofit community. She is a writer and an interfaith minister who has dedicated over 25 years to partnering with human rights advocates around the world in the pursuit of peace, spirituality, and everyday mindfulness. She has worked with the United Nations, the organization Human Rights First, the Miss Foundation for Women, and the Grameen Bank of Bangladesh. She has participated in a delegation of Zen Peacemakers and Lakota elders in the sacred Black Hills of South Dakota. Barbara lives in New York City with her interfaith family and is the author of Heartwood, The Art of Living with the End in Mind. Barbara, we are delighted to have you as a guest on our show.
I am honored to be with both of you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Barbara. So I'd like to ask about Heartwood. Would you be kind enough to share your story and the inspiration behind your book?
Sure. So when my earliest childhood friend, whose name was Marissa, was diagnosed with a terminal illness at the age of 30, I really began to question how we live our life. How can we most fully live our lives? I bought all of the death books that you could possibly imagine. I bought the Stoic philosophers like Marcus Aurelius. I bought spiritual sages and leaders like the Dalai Lama. And I found these common threads, which were that they advise us to live with the end in mind as a way of living fully. And I wondered what that would look like, but it turns out Marissa demonstrated this so beautifully in the final year of her life. She, in spite of her terminal diagnosis, went ahead and married her college sweetheart. Between chemotherapy sessions, she traveled to Italy, which was her family's ancestral home. And she spent such quality time with friends and colleagues and family that I looked at her and I marveled and I wondered, what could I do to, in a sense, imagine that I'm not here forever, which in fact none of us are. So the book started at that point and then became my quest to really examine what this would look like. I live in New York City, as you mentioned, and there are two Zen monks here who started an organization to train people to be present at the bedside of people who are dying. And I became an apprentice to them and worked on the very busy hospice floor at Bellevue Hospital in New York, which is our largest public hospital, where you will find people of many faith traditions and none trying to make meaning of the end of their lives. So it was trial by fire. The book took me through the end of both of my parents' lives. They died within 3 months of one another, and I was present for both of them at the end of their lives, as well as other losses that I encountered along the way.
Wow.
I tell you, one of my favorite theologians, says that if he doesn't think about the fact that he's going to die once a week, he said, I don't feel like I'm truly living. It was the way he put it. And it just reminds me of that idea of the end in mind and what that means. And what a thank you for sharing the inspiration behind the book, and about your friend and her experience and your experience with her and watching her through that.
In many ways, I view Marissa and all of the hospice patients that I have sat with as my teachers. They truly have all taught me things that have enriched my own life. And at the point in my life when I too was diagnosed with an illness, I was diagnosed with breast cancer not that long ago, actually. I had to look at this book that I wrote for other people and read it for myself and see if these lessons actually withstand. And I'm happy to say that they do. I'm also happy to say that I was lucky enough to have been diagnosed early so that my prognosis is very favorable, but it really became a when the rubber meets the road kind of moment, releasing this book and also having this illness myself.
Yeah.
Yeah, we often hear how people in the field of bereavement care believe that they're so equipped to handle death until it's someone that they care for. So very similar to what you're saying, you were able to take these stories, but then faced with your own illness, how does that apply?
Yeah, what was so interesting was that when I heard from my doctor that I had cancer, because of all this work I've done, there was a moment where I was not surprised. People frequently say, why me? And I think I said, why not me? Why not me and why not now? It just seemed like these are things that we practice. We are not in control of cells dividing and things that can happen in our lives. And I knew that it was going to be a different kind of journey, one where I would have to go step by step and remember all of the things that I had been taught along the way.
Now, in your book, do you focus more on the mental, emotional, spiritual journey of being aware of that we all have an end, or is there also a piece to it where it's even some practical things that if we are aware that we have an end, that we prepare for that, preparing for our own end of life and those types of things, or is it a little of both, or maybe it's not any of those things?
So Heartwood is a memoir, and it's interesting because I think that the truest lessons that we learn about grief and loss and love are told in first person. Now, they don't necessarily come in prescribed lists of what to do, but through storytelling, story sharing, and through metaphor. So Heartwood is the title of the book, and it's a metaphor that I discovered by walking through an old growth forest. Inside of every tree is a very solid pillar that is the support of the growth rings that grow around it. And it's called Heartwood. It's prized by woodworkers as the strongest part of the tree. But what most people don't realize is that Heartwood is inert. It's dead. And it no longer participates in the flow of water and nutrients up and down the tree. And it turns out, I think that we're a lot like the trees. I mean, the people who we have loved and lost form our heartwood. They never really go away. They become the essence of who we are and the growth experiences that we have that grow around it.
I love that.
Yeah, I agree.
What a beautiful analogy. Go ahead, Andy, I'm sorry.
No, I was going to say, as you wrote the book and you were telling this story, is there anything that surprised you as you as you began to put that on the paper, or maybe just your own, I don't know, aha moments or that happened during that process?
I would say that the growth that comes personally through the most difficult moments of our lives is something that we often try, we see difficult things and we try to push them away all the time. And in so doing, we miss out on these extraordinary opportunities. I'm thinking about my father a lot lately, since it has just been Father's Day. And he was a brilliant man. He was a neurosurgeon, and he was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease towards the end of his life. And I was his caregiver for a while, and then he went into a nursing facility. And I remember sitting with him one day in the dining area, and we were sitting at a table with some other residents, and I was feeding him because he lost his ability to use utensils by himself. And I was giving him chocolate ice cream, which is his absolute favorite thing. And he was delighted. And the older woman who also had Alzheimer's at the table looked at me and said, "You are so lucky." And it struck me, because if you looked at this, a daughter feeding her father who doesn't have much time left, like, how is this lucky? But she was absolutely right. When we can really drop into the present moment with the people we are losing, who we love dearly, there is this extraordinary ability to enter into the full richness of life.
Yeah, I agree. When my mother was dying with cancer, I was her caregiver, and I referred to it. People would say, "Well, it must be so very difficult," and it was difficult. There's no doubt about it. It was hard and challenging, but at the same time, I felt like it was an honor. I was honored to be able to care for her in the way that I cared for her, and just made me think of that sense that I had of being able to be present with folks. And I'm curious with you, your work at the bedside of people. What is that experience for you? What has that been for you?
Well, one of the things that I love about having done this work in New York City is that it really behooves us to have a diverse and international perspective, which was so great for me, because I had come to this work, as you said in the introduction, by doing 25 years of international human rights advocacy. So in addition to being with patients from all of the major religious traditions and none at all, I also was able to bring in the experience of people I had worked with in the rights arena. So for example, I have a chapter about a friend of mine, a woman named Consolé, who was 14 years old when the Rwandan genocide came to her village. Her father was brutally murdered, and then her 3 little brothers were thrown down the septic tank of her family's home. And Consolé herself was raped and is now HIV positive. So how do we go on from these huge atrocities in our lives? I mean, it turns out that Consolé is a person full of great joy and love, but she will be the first to tell you that for over 6 or 7 years, she cried herself to sleep every night. I mean, we need support. We need support of counselors. We need physical support when we're dealing with something big. And in her case, she derives so much strength from fellow survivors of genocides, not just in Rwanda, but from around the world. Some of her closest friends have become Holocaust survivors. I had this very interesting moment, because I was working in international human rights, I thought this would be my career forever. It was pretty wonderful. But as a result of being at the bedside and watching how people make meaning in their lives through ritual and the stories of their religious traditions, I became extremely interested in how others really conceptualize purpose and where the greater meaning comes from in their lives. So I went back to school, and that's when I became an ordained interfaith minister. It wasn't something that I had intended to do, like setting off on this journey, but it was absolutely an outcome of this work.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's interesting how life is quite often a series of unintended events in our lives as well. I've often joked that I think sometimes life chooses us as opposed to we choose it. We have our plan, and then we're confronted with whatever it is, and we have those moments where we have a realization, and we have a choice to make. You know, for so many of us.
That's absolutely right. In addition to some of these patients who came from the Hindu tradition, for instance, there's a beautiful practice. I walked into the room of a hospice patient who I call Priya in the book, and she was writing in a red pen in her notebook in Sanskrit, and she was writing the same thing over and over and over again. And her husband explained to me that this practice called japa is a way of focusing one's attention on God at the end of their lives. So for her, great meaning and dedication and passion and faith was encapsulated in writing Ram, Ram, Ram over and over again. And it turns out that this was also Gandhi's practice, I learned. He repeated verbally Ram, Ram his whole life, so that when he was shot by an assassin's bullet, the story goes, his last words were Ram.
Wow. Wow. Well, Barbara, thank you for sharing with us. We only have a few minutes left of our time, but before we leave, people who are listening in often want to know how they can connect with our guests. How would people connect with you and with your work?
Great. So Heartwood, I'm holding up a picture of Heartwood for those who can see it as well, is available wherever books are sold. And there's more information and a reader's guide at barbarabecker.com.
Wonderful. Barbara, thank you so much for being a guest here on Let's Talk Death, for sharing your story, for sharing your journey. Truly remarkable. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you for all of the work you do.
Thank you. And thank you to those joining us for this episode of Let's Talk Death. If you would like to learn more about Heal Grief, please visit us at healgrief.org. At healgrief.org, you can learn more about all of the programs and resources of Heal Grief, including our national network of support for grieving young adults called Actively Moving Forward.
And if you know of a bereaved adult, refer them to the AMF app, where adults of all ages can connect with others experiencing a similar death loss. And last, make sure to sign up on healgrief.org to receive our newsletter for links of future episodes of Let's Talk Death.
And so again, with that, thank you for joining us. We will see you next time on Let's Talk Death.